Hello, everyone. In this video, I'm going to tell you about a movie that portrays the struggles of a man, a father's journey to achieve something we all strive for, happiness. To get there, he faces the harsh realities of life, betrayal, and being underestimated. This movie teaches us about perseverance and dedication. This is the story of the pursuit of happiness. The year is 1981 in the bustling city of San Francisco. A father and his young son are walking toward a destination. The man is Chris Gardner and his son is Christopher. Each morning, before heading to work, Chris drops Christopher off at a daycare center. Before leaving, Chris takes a moment to ask the owner to erase inappropriate graffiti written on the wall. This small act shows just how much Chris cares about his son's education, even in the smallest details. Chris works as a salesman, selling portable bone density scanners. Every day, he walks from hospital to hospital trying to sell these devices. However, selling such a product is no easy task. The scanners are only slightly better than X-rays, but cost twice as much. To pay rent and cover daily expenses, Chris needs to sell at least 2 units per month. The problem? Lately, he hasn't sold a single one. This financial strain has severely impacted Chris's relationship with his wife. She is frustrated and unwilling to understand his struggles, no matter how hard he tries to explain. Even so, Chris remains positive, refusing to let anger or resentment take over. The next morning, as Chris is heading out to work, his attention is drawn to an exotic car parked nearby. Curious, he approaches the owner and casually asks, "How did you get this car?" The man responds with a smile, explaining that he is a stockbroker. In that moment, Chris is struck by inspiration. Stockbrokers always seem happy, so why couldn't he become one of them? Excited about the idea, Chris shares his newfound ambition with his wife the following day. He tells her he's good at math and confident he has what it takes to succeed. But instead of support, his wife mocks his aspirations. All she cares about is the money they desperately need, because their rent is 2 months overdue, and they face eviction if they don't pay it by the end of the week. The following day, Chris takes his first step toward pursuing this dream. Outside the grand office of a stock brokerage firm, he nervously hesitates before stepping inside. He leaves his bone density scanner with a woman on the street, offering her a small tip for watching it. He assures her the device is worthless and can't be sold. Trusting her, Chris enters the building. While inside, Chris manages to get into a casual conversation about stockbroking. But mid-conversation, he notices something alarming. The woman outside has run off with his scanner. Panicked, Chris abandons the discussion and chases after her. Unfortunately, she escapes by boarding a train, leaving Chris empty-handed. As if things couldn't get worse, Chris learns that the brokerage firm only accepts 20 interns every 6 months, and from those, only one will be offered a full-time position. The odds seem impossible. Determined, Chris decides to take a different approach. Instead of going through the usual process, he attempts to meet directly with a senior executive, Mr. Twistle. Chris imagines Mr. Twistle as someone who would recognize his potential instantly. But when they meet, it's clear Mr. Twistle is extremely busy. However, he agrees to take Chris's resume and promises to call if there's an opportunity. Meanwhile, Chris's desperation grows. He still hasn't sold any scanners. One day, he spots the woman who had stolen his scanner. A dramatic chase ensues, and Chris eventually manages to recover the device. Exhausted but determined, Chris tries to share his struggles with his wife. Instead of listening or showing empathy, she completely shuts him out. The next day, Chris waits for hours to meet with Mr. Twistle again. This time, he manages to share a taxi with him. During the ride, Chris passionately explains his skills and ambition. However, Mr. Twistle seems uninterested in his story. Instead, he focuses on a Rubik's Cube, claiming it's impossible to solve. Chris, confident in his abilities, offers to solve the puzzle. Skeptical, Mr. Twistle hands it over. Concentrating fully, Chris works on the cube during the entire ride. By the time they reach their destination, the puzzle is complete. Mr. Twistle compliments him, but seems indifferent, treating it as a mere pleasantry. To make matters worse, Mr. Twistle leaves without paying the taxi fare. Chris, with only $5 in his pocket and a fare of $18, grabs his scanner and bolts out of the taxi. The furious driver chases him, and Chris barely manages to escape by jumping onto a train. However, in the chaos, he loses hold of the scanner. Later, Chris arrives home to find his wife packing her belongings. She has decided to leave him, taking Christopher and their possessions. Devastated, Chris receives a phone call from Mr. Twistle, scheduling another meeting. Without a pen to write down the details, Chris memorizes the phone number and extension, knowing this opportunity might be his last chance to turn his life around. The next morning, Chris unexpectedly runs into his wife on the street. As usual, she ignores him completely. Chris steps aside, letting her leave, but insists on keeping their son, Christopher, with him. Frustrated, his wife lashes out, blaming Chris for their poverty. Chris doesn't argue back. He knows she's too overwhelmed by their situation. When he gets home, Chris immediately prepares dinner for Christopher. At that moment, the landlord shows up, demanding they vacate the apartment so it can be repainted for the next tenant. Chris pleads with him, promising to paint the unit himself without compensation, just for one more week of shelter. The next day, it seems that problems continue to chase him. This time, it's the police at his door. They've come to arrest Chris for an unpaid parking ticket. He's taken into custody and held until his case can be processed. The problem? The verification process isn't until 9:30 a.m., and Chris has a critical job interview at the same time. Reluctantly, Chris asks his wife for help picking up Christopher. The following morning, at 9:45 a.m., Chris is released from custody. Without time to shower or change, he sprints to the stockbroker's office. Surrounded by professionals in sharp suits, Chris stands out in his disheveled appearance, but his determination is evident. When his turn for the interview comes, Chris steps into the busy office. The energy is intense. Everyone is hustling and working at full speed. But the interviewers are far from impressed by Chris's appearance. Chris decides to be completely honest. He tells them everything that's happened, the arrest, his struggles, and why he couldn't change into more appropriate clothes. Surprisingly, his honesty strikes a chord with the panel. Chris's charisma and quick thinking shine during the interview. He demonstrates his ability to match their energy and shares his background. He was consistently top of his class in school and excelled during his time in the military. But what makes him different is his humility. Chris openly admits when he doesn't know something but promises to find the answer. The panel is impressed, but there's a catch. The internship offers no salary, something Chris cannot afford in his current situation. Despite the overwhelming challenge, Chris knows walking away would mean wasting this rare opportunity. He decides to go forward with the training. That evening, his wife returns with Christopher, who has fallen asleep in her arms. Her first words are that she's leaving for New York. She's been offered a job by her brother, who owns a restaurant there. Chris doesn't try to stop her. All he asks is for Christopher to stay with him. She hesitates, clearly sad to leave everything behind. Yet from her actions, it's clear she's abandoning Chris at his lowest point. Even then, Chris doesn't let anger or bitterness consume him. After his wife leaves, Chris makes a phone call to Mr. Twistle. He thanks him for the opportunity and confirms that he will join the training program. The next day, Chris and Christopher are forced to move out of their apartment. They find a small, modest motel to stay in. That afternoon, while playing basketball with his son, Chris shares a life lesson. He tells Christopher, "Don't ever let anyone tell you that you can't do something. If you want something, you've got to go get it, no matter what." This moment leaves a lasting impression on Christopher, showing him what true perseverance looks like. One day, Chris finally manages to sell one of his bone density scanners. The money is just enough to get by for a little while. But the next day, Chris begins his first intensive training session as a stockbroker intern. This is called the learning period, as becoming a stockbroker is entirely new to him. In the training, Chris and his peers are briefed by their instructor. Over the next few weeks, they'll be given a list of contacts from the top 500 companies. Their job is to pitch financial products and persuade potential clients to invest. Chris quickly grasps the system. The more people you contact, the more opportunities you create, and more opportunities mean more clients. Clients bring money to the firm, but competition is fierce. Out of 20 interns, only one will secure the position at the end of the program. Chris works harder than anyone. Unlike the others, who work 9-hour days, Chris can only work 6 hours because he needs to pick up Christopher from daycare at 4 p.m. To maximize his time, Chris avoids unnecessary tasks. He doesn't even hang up the phone between calls, saving him 8 minutes a day. He avoids drinking water to cut down on bathroom breaks. Despite his efforts, he often faces ridicule. His manager constantly assigns him non-work-related errands, and every day, Chris calls names from security guards to CEOs, tirelessly pushing to meet his quotas. 2 months into the internship, Chris finally gets a breakthrough. He schedules a meeting with a high-profile CEO named Walter. However, when the time comes, his manager assigns him another task, moving a car parked in the firm's driveway. Chris races through traffic, desperate to reach Walter on time. By the time he arrives, Walter has already left. Later, Christopher discovers that his father has sold their car to pay off debts and buy necessities. To cheer his son up, Chris promises to take him to a football game the next day. On the day of the game, Chris takes Christopher to visit a wealthy acquaintance first. They enter a luxurious neighborhood and head straight to Walter's house. Unlike a typical salesperson, Chris approached the situation like a close friend. He apologized for the wasted time the other day. Long story short, Chris said his goodbyes, mentioning that he had to leave for a football game. Hearing this, Mr. Walter was surprised. He was also going to the same game. This moment sparked a bond between them. Mr. Walter invited Chris to join him in his car. Not only that, but they were also given access to watch the game from the VIP section. Chris showed his exceptional ability to blend in. He flowed naturally with the CEO's energy. Even though his true intention was to sell financial products, it didn't make Mr. Walter uncomfortable. In fact, Chris hadn't even planned on watching the game. After all, where would he get the money? He used this approach because he knew Mr. Walter would attend. Unfortunately, Chris's pitch about the financial product was rejected. The CEO admitted that he couldn't entrust his financial management to someone as junior as Chris. Even so, Chris didn't give up. He leveraged Mr. Walter's connections to gain access to other wealthy individuals. By now, Chris had completed 40 days of training. His scanners had all been sold, and their lives seemed stable until a letter arrived that turned everything upside down. A tax officer had discovered that Chris had been delinquent on his taxes for months. As a result, all the money in his bank account was seized as a penalty. Chris was furious, frustrated with the system, but those were the rules in America. Life had to go on, motel bills still needed to be paid, and their stomachs had to be filled. Broke and desperate, Chris even resorted to collecting a $14 debt from an old friend. At this point, Chris was overwhelmed by frustration. Life seemed determined not to give him a moment of peace. One day, while at the park, Chris accidentally spotted the homeless man who had stolen his scanner. Acting swiftly, Chris retrieved the scanner, which now represented his only hope for survival. Luckily, a doctor agreed to buy the device immediately, but when they tested it, the scanner no longer worked. That evening, Chris returned to the motel only to find that their belongings had been forcibly removed and the locks had been changed. This meant Chris and his son no longer had a place to stay. Anger and sadness consumed Chris, but he knew that getting angry wouldn't solve anything. Instead, he focused on his responsibility as a father. To lift his son's spirits, Chris pretended the scanner was a time machine that could take them back to the prehistoric era. The two played along, acting out the scenario with enthusiasm. Eventually, Christopher fell asleep in his father's arms in a station restroom. That night, as Chris sat by the door to protect them, tears streamed down his face for the first time. The next day, after work, Chris went to a homeless shelter. Unfortunately, the shelter only accepted women and children. Christopher could have stayed, but not with Chris. Chris begged for an exception, and eventually, they directed him to another shelter called Glade Memorial, which would open at 5 p.m. When they arrived, the line was already extremely long. Despite the wait, Chris persevered. However, just as it was his turn, the shelter was declared full. To make matters worse, a homeless man who had cut the line took his place. Outraged, Chris confronted the man, causing a commotion that led to both being thrown out. Thankfully, kind bystanders vouched for Chris, confirming he had been unfairly treated, and he was allowed back in. Even in the depths of despair, Chris managed to comfort his son. When the lights suddenly went out, Chris used it as an opportunity to lull Christopher to sleep, saying it was bedtime. But for Chris, the night was far from over. He still needed to repair the broken scanner. When the room lights were cut off entirely, Chris moved outside to continue working. The next morning, Chris approached the day with renewed positivity. That day, he had an important meeting with a client. However, he needed to finish all his work early because he had to return to the shelter line by 5 p.m. The day was chaotic. Chris even had to rush to the bus stop to ensure he got a spot. Christopher cried, overwhelmed by his father's desperation, but Chris had no other choice. That evening, Chris found himself at a place of worship, pouring out his heart and tears. He had no one else to talk to. At this point, Christopher was all he had left. Time passed, and Chris eventually reached the end of his training program. Tomorrow would be the final evaluation. On the big day, Chris completed the test in just a few minutes. However, he noticed another candidate had finished even earlier. They chatted in the elevator, and the man boasted about how easy the test was. But his arrogance crumbled when Chris mentioned the essay question, which the man had apparently missed. On his way home, Chris ran into the football player he had met earlier. Their camaraderie was evident, and the player even mentioned he was still waiting for Chris's promised call. At the same time, Chris's boss asked to borrow $1 for a taxi, as he had forgotten his wallet. Chris reluctantly obliged. That evening, Chris stood in line again, but when it was his turn, the shelter was full. With no other choice, he spent his last bit of money on train tickets, where he and Christopher slept for the night. The next morning, Chris donated blood for some extra cash, using it to buy spare parts for the scanner. That night, Christopher asked about his mother. Chris reassured him that her departure wasn't his fault, it was her choice. After Christopher fell asleep, Chris continued working on the scanner and successfully repaired it. Finally, the scanner sold for $250, giving them enough money to live comfortably for the next month. They celebrated with a proper stay at a hotel. Despite the luxurious bed, Christopher chose to sleep in his father's arms. The next day, Chris's supervisor praised his hard work. He had secured 31 clients from Pacific Bell. Chris responded humbly, knowing tomorrow would be the real test. The following day, Chris was called into a meeting. His interviewer lightened the mood by joking about the janitor's outfit Chris had worn to the initial interview. Then came the verdict. Chris was offered the position. Tears streamed down his face. It had been an incredibly difficult journey. Later, Chris ran to the daycare, embracing Christopher with overwhelming joy. He called this chapter of his life happiness. This story is based on real events. After years of working in finance, Chris Gardner started his own firm, Gardner Rich. From that point on, Chris devoted himself to philanthropy, donating $50 million to provide housing for low-income families. He also offered job training and counseling for the homeless, knowing firsthand what they endured. Whatever you are going through, no matter how tough the situation, may this story inspire you to persevere and chase your dreams.